Welcome back to Rhythm Explained. In part 1, we discussed beats, pulse, tempo, and counting. Here, we'll cover rests, ties, augmentation dots, and notation. We'll start by returning to the end of part 1, the rhythm tree, and observe its relationship to rests. Let's begin. This diagram covers rhythms in a base 2 system, which is a system that continually subdivides durations into two equal parts. Each duration in this system has an equivalent rest. In other words, the rests represent the same time span, but instead of indicating a measured action, they signify a measured inaction. In short, notes mean sound, and rests mean silence. Starting with the whole note, we have the whole note rest. The time span of this rest is 4 beats, or 4 quarter notes. The symbol itself is memorable because it resembles a hole in the ground. Just remember, whole note rest, hole in the ground. Next, we have the half note and its corresponding rest. It covers the time span of 2 beats, or 2 quarter notes. This symbol resembles a top hat, so just remember, half note rest, hat. Moving on, we have the quarter note and its corresponding rest. It has a unique appearance that makes it easily memorable, especially when compared to the other rests. These next 3 rests share a similar appearance defined by a stem and a number of curved arcs. The arcs correspond to the number of flags. Eighth notes have 1 flag, so eighth rests have 1 arc. In summary, all of these rests are equal in duration to their corresponding notes, but they represent a measured unit of silence. Just like the notes, the names of the rests are always defined by the temporal space they occupy in relation to the whole note or whole note rest. Now that we've covered the basics of rests, I'll introduce ties and augmentation dots. Ties appear as curved lines connecting 2 note heads together. Their purpose is to combine separate note values to form a new duration that equals the sum of its individual parts. For example, tying 2 quarter notes together equals the duration of a half note. While ties are often useful, sometimes they can be redundant. I'll explain this later. Next, we have augmentation dots. Augmentation dots can be applied to both note heads and rests. These dots are typically placed near the note head or in the upper right area of a rest symbol. Notes with dots are called dotted notes, and rests with dots are called dotted rests. Any note or rest can be dotted. We can have dotted whole notes and rests, dotted half notes and rests, and so on. The purpose of augmentation dots is to extend a note's duration by adding half of its original value. For example, a dotted half equals a half note plus a quarter note. You can also express this by tying a half note to a quarter note. This brings us to alternative notation, where both tied notes, dotted notes, and rests can be used to notate the same rhythm as you see here. So with this in mind, what is the point of using one approach over another? Well, the usefulness of each notation style depends on context that affects musical interpretation. A few concepts to keep in mind are instrumental choice, notational redundancy, rhythmic clarity, and dynamic clarity. To cover each concept efficiently, I'll present a snare drum and violin example that use all 3 notational techniques. Then we'll decide which technique is most appropriate based on these concepts. Let's start with snare drum. Although notated differently, the rhythm in the first 2 measures sound identical to the last 2. Measures 1 and 2 used rests, while measures 3 and 4 use augmentation dots and ties. So, what does this tell us regarding instrument choice? Well, the snare drum isn't a naturally sustaining instrument, so using augmentation dots and ties won't affect the sustain. In fact, the use of ties in the last measure is an example of notational redundancy. Without additional information, there's really no need to write this rhythm using ties. As an alternative, simply use half notes or quarter notes with rests. The dotted half in measure 3 isn't a big deal, but using rests in this case can be easier for beginners as they clearly show where the beats fall. This improves rhythmic clarity, which is generally more important for notating or reading percussion music. Moving to violin, we'll see how these techniques can produce different results due to the instrument's sustain. In this context, rests indicate that measures 1 and 2 should be played in a somewhat detached manner. The notes are sustained for exactly the duration of a quarter note, no more, no less. In the next measure, the augmentation dots and ties indicate that pitches should be fully sustained before articulating the next pitch in the sequence. The dotted half indicates that the pitch is to be sustained for exactly 3 beats before re-articulating beat 4. In the last measure, however, the ties are still an example of redundancy. In this case, it would be better to use half notes. With that said, the use of ties would be necessary to provide dynamic clarity. Let's compare 2 examples. In both, we have dynamic markings. In the measure with ties, the performer knows exactly when to play soft and when to play loud, with a clear sense of how quickly the volume should change. In the measure with half notes, it's much less clear how the dynamics should be executed. An experienced performer might infer this, but the use of ties here is much better for dynamic clarity. Thanks for watching. This concludes part 2 of Rhythm Explained.